everybody. Paige here with Ben, and we are here. It's the time of the podcast where we talk about Disney movies and the metaphors that we can find within them that we can use for our personal development. So if you've been following along with us so far, initially we started going in order chronologically of the movies, and we decided that we're going to start bouncing around so we can make sure that we hit on the ones that we really, really love. So
and
today
we're
here
to watch again, because otherwise there's a lot that we'd have to get through.
All of them are good. All of them are pretty good. But today we're going to talk about Lady and the Tramp. So we just rewatched the movie last night, and we're super excited to tell you all about the different metaphors that we found in that movie.
What a sweet love story. Did Benji cry? Yes.
Benji cried.
So I think one thing that's interesting about this movie, I just want to notice this because we heard that this was happening like a couple weeks ago, but we hadn't seen it happen yet until we were watching Lady and the Tramp. Disney has started putting a disclaimer at the front of some of these movies saying, that
there's harmful stereotypes within it.
Yeah, these basically these views that are expressed. It says they weren't right then, they're not right now. But we're leaving the content in there. We're making it whole because we want to spark conversation. And I thought, what do you think of that, Paige? I kind of think that's like a really responsible way of doing what they're trying to do there.
Yeah, I think that there's value in preserving the history of those movies and also putting the disclaimer up just as a way to kind of spark conversation so that people are just being on the lookout for harmful stereotypes and that we're like discussing them and continuing to grow as a humanity and like how we talk about people and different groups of identities. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that for sure. Like one of the questions that I had, and maybe we'll get to some of this, I think, in the podcast, but one of the questions that I had when I saw that was like, well, what exactly are they talking about? Because the one that comes to mind is the Siamese cats, but I don't really, like, having watched the movie, I'm not really sure. I mean, yeah, they did like not great accents for them. Is that what it's about? Is it because they're like Siamese and they're like just associated with trouble? Like, I'm not really sure. I think it would be interesting to hear some conversation or some opinions about it. I think there are some other things that are in it that I kind of doubt that that's what Disney was talking about when they brought it. But there are certainly some things for sure that I could see as being, risky conversations or risky content to have out there in the world. And I think Disney did a really interesting thing. They're like, don't cancel us. We're going to let you know right now that this was, I like that they say it's wrong now and it was wrong then because, anyway, it's just an interesting thing. So it's neither here nor there for the story. Shall we run through the story again like we usually do just to kind of refresh people's memories on Lady and the Tramp if they haven't seen it recently? And if you haven't seen it at all, come on, go.
Oh, man. It was so nice to rewatch it. I was really surprised how many of the parts I remembered. And I was like, in this part, the beaver comes and he cuts the, leash off of her. And, haven't thought about that since I was a kid. So, yeah, let's just, run through the...
Sorry, I just was also going to say, while watching Pinocchio, I remember being like, gosh, this is kind of boring. But Lady and the Tramp, not at all. I didn't have that experience even a little bit while we were watching that.
It's a captivating story. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
It's so interesting to me to note that in Joseph Campbell's work around the hero's journey, usually he conceptualizes quite often that the hero is male, and there's so many Disney movies where the hero is necessarily lady, she's the star of the story, and Tramp kind of plays this. Yeah, he's like an ancillary role to her growth and development. I mean, he also has his own growth and development and transformation as well. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I want to come back to that too because we mentioned it a little bit before, but there are I suspect, and the more I watch Disney movies, the more I see that there are actually two hero narratives. There's a male hero narrative and there's a female hero narrative that happens, and this movie is such a great exploration of what those two hero they both show up in this one, and I love. So I'm excited to talk about that. But first, let's just run through the story. So, Lady is a gift under the Christmas tree as a puppy. And there's this really cute scene which really landed with me because we just went through this with Pixie, but where they try to put her in her bed and then go to bed, and she's whining at the door. And
it really like remembering us a year ago, getting a new puppy and being like, oh, remember when she used to just like follow us around and it was so cute. And we were like 5 minutes into the movie and I was already sobbing.
yeah, that was so funny. But it was so true to life, like just the way that she was whining, and Dad comes down the stairs and he's like, "Lady, no whining," and she like tries to follow him, and he like goes and puts her back in the basket, and then ultimately she winds up just like brute forcing her way into their room and whining at the foot of their bed until they just say, "Okay, but just for tonight," and put her in the bed.
Just for tonight.
That's the creative like time lapse where she wakes up as an adult the next morning in the same spot where they put the puppy. But so the story starts. It's Lady's story. You know how much she loves the couples, John Deere and Darling.
Jim Deere.
That's how
Jim Deere and Darling.
Yeah, and Jim Deere and Darling, because that's how they call each other. And everything's perfect. And she has like some dog friends in the neighborhood. And you know, a few months in, where she gets her collar, they make a big deal of it, which we'll come back to, because they're, you know, oh, it's the highest honor that a man can bestow is your like your collar and your license. And then we see, you know, the couple starts to kind of ignore her a little bit, and she's trying to figure out what's going on, because usually she's like the center of their attention, and it turns out that they're pregnant, and
this is where Tramp enters the story, and he's like, "Oh yeah, there's a baby coming. You're about to get abandoned."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like you know, it was steak dinners, and now it's, you know, now it'll be whatever leftover baby food is. Yeah, it was a warm hearth, but you know, on the fire, and then now it'll be a drippy, leaky doghouse. Yeah, that's it. And anyway, he goes through this. He builds up this like fear narrative. So she's really scared. They finally have the baby. They like Jim Deere or John Deere. Jim Deere.
Jim Deere.
Yeah, Jim Deere holds Lady up to see the baby, and she just falls in love. And that is like that, I think, is the sparking off of the female heroic journey at that point. So we'll come back to that. Anyway, so then they, you know, that's the next scene is the aunt comes to watch the baby. Aunt Sarah, yeah, but she does not like dogs. She's not a dog person. The Aunt Sarah takes her to the pet supply place to get a muzzle for her. And then we have a scene that, as you pointed out, is very similar to the scene from Snow White,
where she has this is like her embarking into the wild, where she gets really frightened and runs away, and there's stray dogs chasing after her, and she's basically running for her life, and that's like the end of her sense of safety.
Yeah, and then Tramp comes and saves her from these dogs, and then it takes her on this whirlwind date, you know, 24 hours of just like adventure and whining and dining. We have the famous,
and then the spaghetti scene.
Yeah, which, you know, you've tried it. If you're listening to this, you've done the spaghetti scene at least once in your life. I know you have. And then we have they wake up in the morning. Tramp is just like, he's like in love, and he's just like spinning out this world for her. He's like, look down there, what do you see? And she says, I see yards and houses, and he says, yeah, but look out there, what do you see? There's beyond the houses, beyond the yards, there's a whole world, and it's just for us, for two dogs on the, you know, living in their freedom. And she says, yeah, but the baby, I would miss the baby. And you know, so he's like, all right,
take care of the baby.
Yeah, he's like, all right, well, I guess I'll take you back. Okay. Lady winds up in the pound. And then we have this scene where there's all these dogs in the pound, and she's both resented and admired for her collar.
And envied, yeah. Because
Mm-hmm.
her collar and her license is like her ticket to freedom, and all the other dogs don't have that. And then there's a scene where one of the dogs, like, he's been in the pound too long, and then he goes through the what is it, the one-way door?
The one-way
or like
door,
yeah, and it's like he's going to be put down, which really highlights the kind of privilege that comes from having this license, and kind of maybe even highlights like classism or whatever.
Yeah,
but then
and so then we go back to. She gets out, they wind up coming and getting her, and now she's so mad at Tramp. And meanwhile, while she was in there, she heard about all of Tramp's escapades and
all of his girlfriends.
Yeah, exactly, and all of his girlfriends. And one of the dogs is a female dog in the prison. She's now really resentful of Tramp because she's heard all of these stories. And then a rat that we had an allusion to in the beginning comes back. She asks, Tramp chases it off. They get in trouble again. She finally breaks free. Aunt Sarah drops dime on Tramp, sends him to the pound. This is the first time he's actually been captured because he's usually able to get out. Lady's friends never loved Tramp, and everybody thinks Tramp actually was trying to hurt the baby until Lady goes and shows the dead rat in the room, and then they, because Jim Deere and Darling got back. Yeah, and then the next thing you see is they let Tramp out, and then Jim Deere and Darling are there and they adopt him basically into the house, and happy ending. They've got puppies.
And they got puppies. Everybody wins.
Exactly. So a few things that I think are going on in this that I think are really interesting. One is this kind of divide between freedom and security, right? So Tramp is living the life. You know, he wakes up in a barrel, stretches. He loves his life. He runs around. He's like, where do I want to eat today? And then he goes. He's like schmoozed all these.
He has like a different family for each day of the week.
Every day of the week, based on what kind of food he wants to eat, he goes to whatever family. And then you have Lady, who she does not have that freedom, right? She has some freedom, but she's very tied to her family, and so she doesn't get to have all the different meals, but she gets to have the family. Right, and this is where
there's a scene that really like highlights kind of this contrast for me is when Tramp finds himself in Lady's neighborhood, and he's like, oh, look at over here in this like fancy dancy neighborhood where I bet there's a lid on every trash can and a fence around every tree. I wonder what the dogs in this and I wonder what the dogs in this neighborhood do for fun. Like, how fun could this possibly be?
Oh yeah, because it's limiting his freedom.
Yeah, and he meets Lady and Jock and Trusty.
Yeah, and comes in and he's like got that tension even from the beginning. He's like, oh yeah, you like kept dogs. You don't know right? Which is an interesting dichotomy because then you go to the pound later and you have all these dogs that are so envious of the collar because they are unlucky enough to get captured and put in the pound, which that never happens to Tramp. So it's like it's an interesting dichotomy here between like the freedom and safety, because he's like, oh, you got to live the life of freedom, but it's only because he has been able to avoid getting captured that he has like a quote unquote like privileged mindset of the world of freedom as it is.
Yeah. What do you think about this piece? What do you think about this piece of like, because it seems like Lady and Jock and Trusty are kind of looking at their life and really like indulging in kind of like the privilege of the safety and luxury and like having everything they need, and they're kind of looking down on Tramp and his way of life, and then Tramp is also kind of looking back down from where he is at on his way of life. I think that that's like an interesting, like we see that play out in like all over our world, like our society, different groups of people judging different groups of people, and really like who has it better, like who's like got it right. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting because if it were anyone other than Tramp doing the looking down on the Park Avenue dogs or whatever, I think that it would be like a fox and sour grapes kind of a situation where they're like, oh, like you can't have it, so you look down on the thing because they're all envious of the collars, right? But Tramp's a little bit of a different situation because he's not actually envious of the collar. Like in a very genuine way, he is on a heroic journey for immortality through song, right? Like he wants his exploits to be sung for ages, right? And they literally sing a song about him. So what's really interesting, because that heroic journey, for the masculine heroic journey, is immortality through accolades, through like your name in the stars, or your face
to
in the stars,
become a legend.
Yeah, to become a legend. That's what the heroic myth is always about for the masculine archetype, okay? But the feminine archetype has a different heroic objective. The heroic objective for the feminine archetype is to DNA immortality through baby. And you can see that's the one reason that Lady gives to not go out on the adventure with Tramp. She says, "But what about baby?" And in the show, she's talking about like Jim Deere and Darling's baby, but actually we see at the end of the movie she's talking about her babies. She wants to have a safe like house with a yard and all that stuff for babies, for safe babies. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because Tramp is on this heroic journey, but in some ways, and this is where, because her job in every heroic myth, we've talked about this before, there's the heroic choice where the hero has to choose between either going off and living the life of legend or staying with the family and, having a different kind of DNA. You give up your legendary status, but you have DNA immortality, right? And that's a heroic myth, and it's given to all the ancient heroes. That happens, and they say no. They say, "No, thank you. I'm going to go live my legendary life." That's why we know them as heroes now. Okay? But with this one, and with a lot of the Disney movies, it's really interesting. It almost seems like the tension between these two archetypes happens, the masculine hero myth and the feminine hero myth. Because in this one, this is Lady's story. She's the hero of this. So we're in a feminine archetype story. For her, she wins when she convinces Tramp to stay with her, right? And make baby and have baby and protect baby. And that's actually how he proves himself to her at the end, is he protects the baby, right? Because she was done with him. You're just a tramp. You're just using me, right?
Yeah. I want to take just a second to kind of retouch on one of our philosophies, that as we're discussing kind of the male, not male and female, but masculine and feminine archetypes, that it's descriptive and not prescriptive. Like, we're not necessarily saying that all women have a journey to then go into the world and make baby and keep some male in their world from going out and becoming a legend. Like,
yeah, and if you want to go listen to the first one of these podcasts that you and I did together, where we talk about what we're talking about with these myths. Like, we're really looking at paths to
I just want to highlight that anybody listening, it is not to say that the right way of being is you as a woman need to find some man and keep him down and make him have babies with you. That's definitely not what we're saying. In fact, I would say this story of Lady and the Tramp even highlights the opposite, that there's not really a right way of being, that there's pros and cons to being a tramp. There's pros and cons to having a safe and secure home life and family, and that I think each person individually can figure out for themselves what their kind of balance for their life is, and be able to design it knowing that there's going to be kind of this tension between the safety and security and some kind of other type of freedom to adventure and legendary experience.
Mm-hmm. And you actually brought up a really good point, because this Lady and the Tramp also sort of mirrors the dichotomy between having a job and starting a business. Right?
For me, that was the biggest point that I took away from this movie, especially as somebody who works with people who are starting their own businesses or have their own businesses, trying to go from that transition of the security of having a job and having insurance. And there's so many people in society around us saying well, you gotta have insurance, you can't not have insurance, you need that 401k. And so breaking into becoming starting your own business and becoming an entrepreneur or solopreneur, becoming a freelancer, necessarily means foregoing some of that security of somebody else always supplying you with the work, that you then have to develop a new skill set of figuring out how do you find the people who want what you have to offer and show up vulnerably saying, here's what I do, would you like it? and being faced with that over and over again.
Yeah, and you see that Tramp is at heart a salesperson.
Oh, yeah.
Because from the very first scene we see him, he's already setting up the tension because he wants Lady, presumably, so he's already setting up the tension for her in her reality of like planting the seeds of what's going to happen that's going to be so uncomfortable for her. So he's like building up a pain-pleasure dichotomy for her right from the beginning. He's like, you used to have steaks, now you're going to have baby food. You used to have a warm fire, now you're going to have a doghouse, and he's like really speaking from his experience. It's almost like, I've lived this life, I know all about it, and that's why I'm free now, right? But you even see he's like a salesperson, because even when he like he's very entrepreneurial. He's really trying to figure out, when he goes to talk to the beaver, he's like he convinces the beaver to snap her out because she's trapped in the muzzle. And he's like, oh, we got to get you out of this muzzle, so let's go. And he goes to the beaver and he like sells the beaver on the muzzle. He's like, and the beaver's like, I don't have time to talk to you. And he's like, yeah, well, because the beaver's working really hard to push this log. And he's like, yeah, that's because you don't have a log puller. And the beaver's like, what? A log puller? What are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, this thing right here, you just wrap it around the log and it'll pull you. He's like, well, I'd have to try it. So he snaps him out of it. Anyway, there's this like real like kind of scrappy entrepreneurial nature that we see in Tramp. So I like that you picked up on that there's this dichotomy.
I also think my sense is the way that the Tramp is kind of depicted a little bit, especially in that scene with the beaver, is kind of like a little bit of the like dirty salesman kind of hard sell infomercial. It felt like it was, where it could have been some sort of like, hey, let's all work together and like create something new. It was like he was trying to trick the beaver instead of just saying like, hey, we're in a bind, we have this thing that could help you. Hey, do you want to like help us out, and then you can use this thing to be the log puller? I think yeah. And ultimately, like when Tramp ends at the end of the story as like a housed dog, it's kind of like this messaging within our society that is kind of pushing up against entrepreneurialism, or like it's like a society that really values safety and security, and kind of portraying the Tramp as disingenuous a little bit as a salesperson, which I think really contributes to our own like societal narrative around like sales is bad.
Yeah, well, maybe because it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because I don't see it that way. Because he goes to the beaver, and what happens is he's solving a problem, right? And he's solving a problem for Lady, and he's solving and for him, and he's solving a problem for the beaver, right? So what happens is he comes up and he tries to get the beaver to have a conversation with the beaver, and the beaver says, no, I'm not interested in having a conversation, I'm too busy doing what I'm doing right now. Okay. Yeah. But he still has this problem that he's trying to solve, right? And so he's like, okay, well, let's put it in terms that are helpful to the beaver. And what's interesting is like, because it's not a sleazy sales tactic. What he does is he actually takes a problem that he has and a problem that the beaver has. He merges them into the same problem, and then it actually solves both problems. Like at the end, the beaver's really happy that he made the purchase. Functionally,
yeah. And also, Tramp does say like, hey, these things reduce something by 66%, and it works in X number of cases. Like has some sort of data on this product that he doesn't actually have. Yeah, it's not even like a real product.
Yeah, but he's right. He winds up being right. Like, no sooner does the beaver get the log puller around him than the log that he was having such a hard time getting in place winds up in place, right? And so I think there's something to be said here about it. Because it seems like you want to call him a car salesman or a disingenuous, but he actually solves a legitimate problem, and he just does it with his power of belief in the solution to the problem. And he comes and he shares his belief, right? And it actually does wind up being at least 66% easier to get.
I think it is an interesting kind of way to look at, because we do talk about sales a lot with our clients, right? Of if the beaver was kind of in the middle of this log project, and if Tramp wasn't able to get his attention, putting the benefits in, even though there was benefit for Tramp and Lady as well, but putting the messaging in the mind of like what the beaver gets out of it as a way to like inspire the beaver into action is kind of an interesting like sales lesson that we can take away from that little anecdote.
Mm-hmm. And he even follows the AIDA formula, like AIDA. He gets his attention. He literally yells at him. He gets his interest. He says, "Oh, like I can see," because it's the name of the thing. Log puller. What? Did you say log puller? He gets his interest. Then he builds up a desire. He says, "Yeah, 66% easier pulling logs." And then finally, call to action: just snap right here to kind of like sign on the dotted line or whatever, right? So he goes through like an actual sales process with the beaver, which I think is really cool. But he's very entrepreneurial. So Tramp is always like solving problems, basically, and like. He is also very people focused. That's his path to success. Is he like goes out and he meets all the different restaurant owners and all the different families. Just he gives them the pleasure of feeling good, right? Because they all love him. Everybody loves him except for the dog catcher, right? And literally everyone. But anyway, so the other thing that I wanted to point out about the two heroic myths is that in some ways, while Tramp is getting pulled away from his heroic myth by Lady to go be a dad, in some ways he's already achieved his heroic end. Like it's almost like his quest is already over because he's literally immortalized in song. They literally sing a song about him in the jail, right? Because what's her name, Pat or whatever,
Peg,
the other dog, Peg, yeah, sings a song about and so. In some ways, it's like his hero myth is concluded, and now he can come be a part of Ladies, which I think is a really interesting dichotomy. I want to talk about one other thing because we didn't talk about it yet. This collar thing, and I think it's so interesting because the collar. We don't think about it because they're dogs, but like a collar is a way of controlling something, and then her and her friends, they're like, "Oh, it's a collar. It's like it's the highest honor that man can bestow upon dogs," which is such an interesting take on a collar. And so what I think is really interesting in this story is that you either have a collar and a license, or you go to jail indefinitely and then die and then are ultimately killed for not having a collar. And what an interesting thing that is. And this is where I was like, is that why they put the disclaimer at the front? Because what they're, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of, it's so interesting because we don't think about it when it's dogs, but and that what it means to have a collar and a license. But when you anthropomorphize the dogs and now they're people in dog bodies, and you have people like wanting the collar, or if they don't have a collar, going to prison, essentially, right? It's not a big leap to see that in our own history in this country, at least, where we had people that we had in collars, and then if they got free from the collar, we put them in prison. And that's like the history. So I was like, is that why they put the disclaimer on? or is it really because of the Siamese cats being? But I thought that was a really interesting thing. It was like the collar represented safety, and all of the people with the collar, they were like bought into the idea of the collar, and even trying to recruit other people into the collar, right?
Well, this story is told from the perspective of man, right? Like if we took a deeper look into the experience of a dog, like you and I talk about this sometimes, like we've got this dog Pixie, and she loves to just run around and sniff stuff, and putting her on a collar necessarily means, like, for me, it's like safety. Like I want to keep her safe. I want to keep her from like running into the road, or like running and like jumping up on somebody and like hurting them, right? So it's safety for me. But if she had her own like free will, would she necessarily choose that for herself?
Yeah, because it's interesting. I think about it a lot, and I walk her without a leash all the time because for me, it's her only time where she actually gets freedom. And so we have this being here who is like essentially, it's not a nice way of looking at it, but it's sad to look at it that way, but she is essentially our prisoner. She doesn't have freedom. She doesn't really she has like within the house, she can do whatever she wants to, unless she wants to go in another room. Right now she's laying in this room. So she's sleeping, you know what I mean? She doesn't really have any freedom. And then I'm in complete control of her life. And we even call them pets, which is so funny. We like name them for the objective benefit to us. This is an object that we have that we pet. and that is like what we call these things. And so it's a really interesting dichotomy for me. I a lot of times I'll have ethical dilemmas around it, and I don't really know where I land on it, because honestly, like, I love Pixie, and life without her is so sad, and I think she loves me too, but also like Stockholm syndrome. Like, I don't know, is that what's going on? I don't know, but it's like it's a really interesting dilemma.
Yeah, I want to bring this into like practical terms as far as people in their lived lives, and like as a listener of this show, and maybe just highlight the experience of, in our world, in a lot of ways we do have a lot of expressed freedoms, but just like Pixie, there are some things that we would not be part of society if we didn't conform to, like certain types of action. I mean, freedom ultimately might be, at some point, might be an illusion. And when we think that we should have more freedom than we actually do, then we set ourselves up for unrealistic expectations, and we experience a lot of strife. So I bring this up because I often think about Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, in the book that he wrote. So he was a trained psychotherapist and was a prisoner during the Holocaust. And there's this beautiful moment in the book where he said, like, he was, marching out for labor for the day, and it's cold and his shoes are worn through, and he starts thinking about his wife, who at this point he doesn't know if she's alive or dead, and he is just pleased with the thought of recollecting her. And then he looks up and there's a beautiful sunrise. And he has this really beautiful moment in the depths of like one of the most horrific human experiences, and still has the freedom ultimately to choose what he does with his mind. And to me, that's like the epitome of that book, and a lesson that I really like. I really appreciate for myself, of thinking about, it would be nice if things were different and I had more freedom and control in some aspects. And at the end of the day, nobody can take away from me how I use my mind and what I choose to like put my energy toward.
Yeah. And then there's this awesome, or I'm glad you brought that up, because there's this other trope that happens in myths. And we see this in like Little Mermaid between King Trident and Ariel. What in some ways King Trident represents is the overbearing nature of societal structure, right? And that it's too constricting. And so you have Ariel, who just wants to have some freedom, goes off and has some adventure in direct contradiction of what her father's wishes are, right? And so you can see that trope happens here, because Aunt Sarah has she represents the same thing as King Trident does. She like is the rules, very no dogs on the bed. Like, she's very strict and structured, right? And that's what ultimately leads to the rising action of Lady running away. It's because she literally tries to put a muzzle on her.
Totally.
Right?
What I think is so interesting about what you're saying right now is, and this has been coming up in my sessions with clients lately, is that same kind of tension between follow the rules and do the right thing and subscribe to these like norms versus this desire to want to kind of self-express is playing out inside of us. Right, this kind of tension between like there's a right way to do things and then there's a way that I want to do things. And when these two parts come into tension, we do something like Lady and we run away, or we get ourselves into trouble like the Little Mermaid losing her voice, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I love that, and that's, by the way, that's a tactical thing to be on the lookout for, is anytime you're thinking right, wrong, good, bad, shouldn't that language pattern, that is that same archetype inside of us. That's the King Trident archetype. That's the Aunt Sarah archetype that's like putting us into a box as though there's only one way to live in society. Right. And so that's like, that is our collar inside of us that we've like identified, that we have praised and gotten excited about this collar, because like there is a right way to do things, and if only I can figure out the right way to do things, then everything will be okay. And it's like, yeah, cool. And also the trade-off there is we'll get oppressed and experience less freedom. So I think that this movie it's awesome the way that it plays it out a couple different ways. The masculine feminine archetype, freedom versus security, like what it means, the haves and the have-nots too. Like that's what's showing up in this, and all of these tensions, I think, why it's called Lady and the Tramp is that the movie is kind of trying to show us that there's this balanced point between the two, because you find at the resolution of the movie they've got the puppies, and there's the one puppy that's like Tramp, who is just a total rebel. He's just like he's trying to tear everything up. The ones that look like Lady, they're all well behaved and sweet, and then there's this one boy, and he's running around like tearing things up or whatever. And I think that's like what we're trying to find at the end of the day for all of us is the heroic resolution to this is to have both the family and the DNA immortality and the rebellious freedom in balance and in harmony for us.
Totally. Yeah.
Cool.
I think this was it was such a good conversation. I don't have any more points that I would like to make. I feel pretty complete.
Me either. Other than just let us know if you have any thoughts on what else the disclaimer was about. That's the one question. I'm like, what was that disclaimer about? So if you're listening to this and you have any thoughts on that, let us know. Otherwise, great conversation, wifey. Thanks for having it with me.
Thanks.
See you next week. And in the meantime, live your freedom and love your life.